We would like to share, first of all, even just the beginnings, just really at a surface, that we are Michiganders by 6 years. We lived in Midland, Michigan, and that's where our introduction to human trafficking began. But I think there's something that can be heard, and I hope is heard throughout the presentation. That is, what you're doing here in your own communities, what you're doing here in Michigan can have an impact not only in the community, but also in a global way. It's part of the story that I'm going to share about how I got introduced to human trafficking, but it's also a story of our life together here as a family. We spent 6 years in Michigan, and Orly was born in Midland, Michigan. She already can show you on the mitten hand, where she was born. She's a proud Midlander also. So let's begin. In our time together, I'd like to introduce myself once again in a very fun way. I'd like to introduce to you some of the things that I have learned about human trafficking right here in Michigan. I'd also like to encourage us to not just know about these things, but then actually try to take some action, consider some ways to get involved. Juan is going to pivot then to the Philippines, introduce us to some of the Philippines and a case study about human trafficking. We'd finally like to introduce you to the Philippine and other Asian partners. So the other churches, the other organizations with whom we are working throughout, mostly Southeast Asia, with some exceptions in South Asia. And then finally, we'd like to conclude our time by thinking about ways that you can continue to get involved and ways for us to stay in touch. So before I do that, again, because of the nature of human trafficking, because of the topic itself, it requires pastoral sensitivity and understanding that even in a room as diverse as us, we are all in a different place in terms of our experiences of abuse and exploitation. What I and Juan are about to share may trigger for your own experiences. And so I would commend to you not only the pastoral leadership, but also the pastoral care of your respective churches. If for some reason something that we say is triggered, we'd also like you to consider that this is not to sensationalize the issue, but really to understand the pastoral sensitivity in such a topic as human trafficking. Now, I'm not going to ask you to guess how old I am. You could guess if you wanted to, but I will simply say that I am in my 40s, and I grew up in the 80s, okay? And I grew up reading this book series, Choose Your Own Adventure. Does that book series kind of ring a bell for some folks? I see some smiles of acknowledgement. We're going to imagine ourselves through a book like the Choose Your Own Adventure, but in a fun way. I would like to imagine just for a moment. You may not feel that you are required to do this, but let's try to be a little fun, and let's imagine that you are a preacher. Some of you may say, I've never preached before. Let's just imagine. And let's imagine for a while, and this is going to pertain to the men in the room, let's pretend that you are a woman, okay? Just for a little bit. Now, let's put ourselves in this scenario. You are invited to preach at the closing worship service for the upcoming Presbyterian Women Fall Gathering. There'll be workshops about human trafficking at that event. What do you say? Now here's where the adventure begins. And here are your choices. A, no thank you. No way, Jose. B, yeah, but I don't know much about this topic. Someone else is going to help me to do the research, a little bit more of the heavy lifting around this topic. C, sure, this sounds like a great opportunity, and not only will you preach, but maybe we could have some Sunday school, adult education classes around the topic. Now, given the choices between A, B, and C, let's review. A, who's in the A crowd? What's your adventure going to take you? Yeah? Okay, A, thank you for your honesty. Yes. Yeah? Okay, B, yes, but are there some yes buts? Okay, thank you. And then finally, C, sure, and. Okay. Friends, this is not just adventure. This is the adventure that awaited me in the, just about this time of year in 2013. And you should know that I accepted the invitation. But the invitation to preach for a woman, Lake Huron Presbyterian gathering of women, the sermon really was being preached at me. I was preaching at myself. Because at the end of that sermon, I could not walk away. That sermon, and I don't know for those who are preachers in the room, this was not a one and done deal. Okay? Something churning in my gut to say, this is not over. And then that coincided with the introduction to several community leaders, including a state senator, and the information that I'm about to share with you that I learned about human trafficking. So in order to kind of take us through some of the things I learned, this is another interactive exercise that I'm calling, What Do These Have in Common? I'm about to flash a number of phrases or words, and I'd like to think out loud. I'm not scoring, there's no pop quiz or anything like that. There are no wrong answers. I just want to hear kind of what you might be thinking, especially when it comes to human trafficking. What do these have in common? So let's do an example. A farm, a restaurant, a nail salon, an in-home daycare, and a massage parlor. Now, when it comes to human trafficking, what do these phrases, these words, what do they have in common? Somebody saw this presentation before I put it up here. These are all potential locations for human trafficking. And just for a moment here, I'm going to share that this is right here in Michigan. Okay, I'm reminding people of that. Now, what about these phrases, or these words, pardon me? Force, fraud, and coercion. How they get victims. Yeah. These are the legal terms that describe the actions behind human trafficking. If we were to do this tonight, if we looked at the U.S. federal law against human trafficking, these are the actual words: force, fraud, and coercion. Let me take you through a really brief example of how that plays out. Let me introduce you to a scenario that I was first introduced to through a sheriff's deputy in the Midland County, who shared about two young boys who were catching the attention of one of their school teachers. Not in a good way, though, because these two young boys, they didn't seem like they were able to keep up with their schoolwork, but also their clothing was soiled, and somehow they didn't seem like the typical students. When the teacher reached out to the parents to discuss the situation for these two boys, the boys were pulled out of the school system and put into a homeschooling environment. And in this homeschooling environment, the two boys were now working on the family farm. And the parents that were entrusted to their care, these were foster parents. So the homeschooling system, the foster care system, all a cover to work as child labor in this situation. And the coercion comes into play here. The boys most likely wanted to rebel against this scenario where they were forced to work and really not learning at all. Because their school environment, at the end of the day, of a hard day of labor, their school books were thrown at them by their parents and said, "That's your school." And if the boys wanted to say anything, I'm sure that the abuse they received, the maltreatment they received, whether it really did come to that or even the perceived threat of it, could have constituted the coercion. If the boys wanted to say something and the parents, the foster parents, could say, "No, we're the ones in control here. We can threaten your lives." That's coercion. What about these phrases? Super Bowl, urban or metropolitan, impoverished. What do these phrases have in common?
Increased activity. Increased trafficking activity.
Increased trafficking activity. Large number of people, yeah. Friends, you may have some perceptions, but these reveal that there's still some partial information out there. And here's what I mean by talking about the common myths. The Super Bowl is one day of the year. Human trafficking is still happening 364 other days of the year. And the urban or metropolitan places, these are not just where trafficking victims are found and where the trafficking activity can happen. Why? Because some, as I described earlier with the farm, this was here in Midland County. This was not in an urban or metropolitan setting. And the other myth that I want to bust here is the idea of impoverished. Yes, human trafficking victims can often be found in impoverished communities, but those who are economically benefiting from the labor of workers or the sex slavery, these individuals, these companies, these whatever systems there are, they're not impoverished. They are benefiting economically from these traditional systems that perpetuate human trafficking. They are far from impoverished. What about these phrases? Human trafficking survivor, emergency room nurse, the community relations police officer, a parole and probate court, a shelter for domestic violence victims. What do these phrases have in common? They're all linked. They're all linked. They're all help. Did I hear the word help? These are all people can help. And you're right, friends, because these were the same people and the organizations that were represented at the earliest meetings of the Midland County Human Trafficking Task Force. What I learned was not just from the community resources, but what I learned came from a resource known as the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force. This is a statewide task force that's housed in the Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice. The task force, while it is statewide, is now broken down into more regional and county-wide task forces. It's a resource that I commend to you. And I really suggest that in the future, if you are serious about getting involved with anti-human trafficking efforts, to ground your advocacy in their work. Given what you have heard, or perhaps what you already know about human trafficking, I'd like to consider now some ways that you might, as individuals, or even a faith community, might get involved in the anti-human trafficking efforts. I'm going to first introduce this idea of prayer, but prayer in not the traditional sense. Why do I mean that? I tend to think that when we think about human trafficking, the focus is only on the victims. There's nothing wrong with that. But let me just expand for your imagination that what if the perpetrators were also once victims of abuse or exploitation? What if this is a deeper network of hurt, of exploitation that keeps on in a cycle of violence? The only way that I believe prayer can change us and change the world is if prayer can include victims and perpetrators. The conversations around human trafficking do not have to be an adult-only conversation. If you have Android smartphones, do you know that there's a smartphone free app available called the ACT? ACT stands for Awareness Combats Trafficking. This smartphone app was developed specifically for tween age, so our 9, 10, 11-year-old, to introduce them to how to identify human trafficking and how to prevent it also. I'd also like us to understand the value of a trusted and safe and life-giving relationship between an adult and a child, or an adult to an adult, especially where trust and confidence might have been betrayed. This kind of relationship naturally may happen for many of us in our own families. But for some, the families, this trust has been violated. And so the power and the transformative power of educating and mentoring. Let me say this also. In these kinds of relationships, sometimes when the topics can be anything, the topics can be also about sexuality. And if these conversations of sexuality can think and help us to understand that sexuality is a gift, sexuality is not what makes us dirty, this can be an antidote to the shame that someone has felt, perhaps if they are a sex trafficking survivor. I'd also like us to consider what it might mean to be an advocate. I see now, as I've driven through Michigan these last 2 weeks now, that it looks like there's about elections to take place for parole, probate court, and different state senators. Do you know where these candidates stand when it comes to the anti-human trafficking laws? Would you like to know? Maybe they don't. It's not on their radar screen. Would there be a chance for you to be an advocate by voting for and supporting those kinds of potential public servants? These are just some of the ways that we can be involved locally.
Thank you, Cathy. Hi, I'm Juan Lopez, Juan Carlos Lopez Carrasco. And as some of you might know, I'm a professional immigrant. The Southeast Asia will be the 4th continent I work in. So I've been around for a long time in a lot of places. And for the one who don't know, I know some of you knows, but can you guess where I'm from? Of course, you knew it. Yes, I'm French. Je suis français. So I'm a world champion, as we say right now. We did win the World Cup because, as you can see, France is a very diverse country. So let's talk a little bit about the Philippines and what we're doing there. So as you can see on the map here, the Philippines, it's an archipelago. I'm going to give you a little historical background. So the Philippines are named Philippines because of the King Philip, the Spanish, and Magellan found this place, and they named it after the king. Magellan, the explorer, died actually in the Philippines. There's this tomb in Cebu. When the Spanish arrived, they found out that the south of the Philippines, around the Sulu archipelago, was already a sultanate. The Muslims were already in Indonesia and Malaysia, and so when they arrived in the Philippines, they found out that the Muslims were already in the south of the country, and so they continued the war they had in Europe, and so that war has been going on for a long time. So you might hear a lot in the news about conflict with Islamic groups there. It's nothing new. It's been there for a long, long time. The shape of the war has changed, and the fighters have changed, but it's still a conflict between the Catholic Church, the Catholic country, and the Muslim population there. So it's a strong Catholic country. The Spanish left at the end of the 1800s, and the Americans took over. When the Americans took over, they put English as the main language for administration purpose, and they moved the capital to Manila. And so since the late 1800s, the Filipinos learn English at school, and they do their paperwork in English. And so they speak English very well. And for most of them without accent. So they know I'm not a Filipino because I have an accent. So so that's a little bit about the history of the Philippines. Since the Americans arrived, the Filipinos started to work a lot outside of the country. They were brought to the US to work on farms. If you go to Hawaii, for example, the third ethnic group in Hawaii are Filipinos. They moved in Hawaii 100 years ago to work on the farms there. Sugarcane, essentially, sugarcane farmers. There are actually some very interesting children's book about Filipinos workers coming to the US a century ago. And they never moved back, so the communities are still around, and so they use, and it's part of their economy to have workers working outside of the country. It's so strong that actually they named their own denomination called OFWs, Overseas Filipino Workers. This acronym is used a lot, especially in the news. A person from the Philippines who is living and working in another country. To show you the scale of how many workers are outside of the country, just try to figure out that 10% of the population live outside and work outside of the country. Not the working population, the full population. 10 million out of 100 million live outside of the country. And as you remember the map, it's an archipelago. It's not a continent. It's not attached to a piece of land. That means people have to fly far away from their houses to work, from their family, and most of the time they fly alone. So try to imagine if your dad's or mom's commute was 10 miles flight, and they will come home only for Easter and Christmas, which are the most, in a Catholic country, of course, the most important holidays in the year. So where do they go? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain. What does those countries have in common? Oil, which means? Money.
Yeah.
A lot of money. Extremely rich countries with a lot of wealthy people in need of third services workers. And one of the biggest strengths of the Filipino is they speak very well English. Actually, the Philippines is the #1 call center in the world, more than India. When you call for help and you hear an English speaker with no accent, you know he's a Filipino. Because that's what they do. The Philippines is so well known for the English level that actually a lot of people from other countries in Southeast Asia goes to the Philippines to learn English. We have a lot of Koreans coming to the Philippines to learn English because it's cheaper to learn English in Philippines than coming all the way down to the US. So there's a lot of schools in the Philippines that teach foreigners how to speak English. So that's one of their big strengths. So yeah, they go where the money is, and Middle East, of course. You can notice also United States, New Zealand, and Australia, which are strong English-speaking countries. And in the United States, there's been a long, long time they've been coming here, and there's a lot of what we call Philam, Filipino Americans. So what do they do? What kind of work do they do? Household service workers, manufacturing, nursing, waiters, cleaners, care workers, engineer, constructions, plumbers. Yeah, it's very hard to find plumbers, so we're happy when they're around. So those are the major jobs they are hired to do around the world. Why do Filipino need to get out of the country to work? Why? What's the main reason to leave the country to work?
Money.
Yeah, money.
Money.
The Philippines is one of the countries with the biggest wealth gap in the world. Where we live, we can see people living on the bridges. They live on the bridges in a country which rains 300 days a year. It floods all the time, and people are sleeping down there. At the same time, you're going to have a high-rise building with people driving luxury car. That's the place in the world I've seen the most Lamborghini. And I'm from Europe, so I've seen a lot of those. 2 out of 10 Filipino families earn half of the total family income. It's that big. It's a huge wealth gap. So there's not enough money. There's not enough money for everybody. And so they have to go outside of the country to find wealth. In 1986 marks the People Revolution. It's the end of the dictator Marcos' time. So 1986, it's when the people took over the government and they became their democracy. So this shows a little bit how the economy in general moved since 1986. So you can see that the GDP on manufacturing, it's almost similar, from 24% to 23%. The agriculture, it's almost cut in half, 17% to 9.5%. Agriculture is a very big part of the Filipino life. But today, they cannot grow enough rice for their people. They have to import it from Thailand because there's not enough rice for people and farm for rice. A lot of big companies bought the farms, bought the lands to produce and sell what brings money. And what can you get in those islands that are very loved by people all around the world? Coconut, mangoes, bananas, pineapples, guava, and a lot of exotic fruit. So there's not enough rice for people. Of course, the population also grow very fast. A third of the population of the Philippines are millennials, so they're very, very young people. The unemployment, it's almost double, 7.6 to 11.5. So that's a big difference. And the last line, you might not be able to read it, but it's how many workers per day are leaving the country to work outside. 1,000 to today 5,000. 5,000 people a day make the decision to leave their country, to leave their lands, to go to live in another country. Sometimes a country they don't speak the language. The Filipinos speak very well English, but in Saudi Arabia, they speak Arabic. So can make a very big change in their life. The change is so big in the Filipino culture that a lot of them are considered heroes because they sacrifice their life to be able to send back money home. So let's go back a little bit on the map here. The Philippines is an archipelago. Try to figure out over 7,000 islands. Over 7,000 islands. 2,500 of those islands have people living on them. It's a maze, a true maze of water. On the eastern side, it's the Pacific Ocean. You can make lines between the Philippines and the US with nothing on it, no lands between. On the left side, you're going to have the China Sea and all the countries around. So this is a perfect place for piracy. This is a perfect place for people owning boats and doing traffic. It's easy to hide. It's easy to get lost. It's easy to drive the Marines crazy. And so there is a lot of trafficking going on, and for a long time. So what do they traffic? They traffic goods, a lot of goods. They traffic a lot of drugs, people. And so it's kind of a heaven for pirates. So when we moved to the Philippines in March 2016, they were in the process to elect a new president. And Rodrigo Duterte was elected in June 2016. Rodrigo Duterte decided one of his first measures was to fight drugs. So he started what we call the war on drugs. His idea was, if we get rid of drug dealers and drug users, we get rid of drugs. And so he started that campaign, giving the power to policemen to be judge, jury, and executioners. Killing without trial, without proof. So if you don't like your neighbor, you call the cops and you tell, hey, he's a drug dealer. And then he might get killed in the night. And he will even give money to the cops that do a good job. So that started a war that considered by some universities in the Philippines up to 5,000 people died in 2 years out of that war. The UN rights group estimate that a little bit more than that. And of course the government scaled down to 2,000, 1,500. So he just renewed 2 days ago during the State of the Union of the Philippine government that he doesn't care about human rights, he cares about human life, and he's going to continue that war on drugs. So when I work in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, I learned that when a drug dealer gets killed, it's a job opening. You're going to see kids being killed, and the next day there's another kid at the same place doing the same thing. When your dad or your mom get killed by the police on suspicion of drug using or drug selling, your social life is kind of dead. Going back to school, living with your neighbors around, it's very hard to get your life back. And then you're suddenly the breadwinner of the family. 13, 14 years old, nobody wants to hire you, you have no qualification. So the only job available is selling drugs. That's the kind of circle of violence that those war on drugs brings usually. The government sadly doesn't have the means and the money to provide enough centers of rehabilitation, and so it's essentially a war on the poor. So what do we do? What do I do there? What's my job there? This is a demonstration from one of our partners, the NCCP, the National Council of Church in the Philippines. Those murders are called extrajudicial killings, EGKs. And just for information, it's very popular in the Philippines. The Filipino are very approve this politics in majority, according to the polls. So we have a lot of kids that end up without parents, that witness the murder of their parents, and that are suffering the consequences, the social consequences of having a family member being killed in that war on drug. So just to give you a little background, I'm a sociologist. I'm specializing in kids' imagination. I've been working over 20 years with children who suffer from trauma or have been abused. So in the Philippines, I work with different child advocacy groups, and I provide training, support, and workshops to teach about how to work with children that have been in situation of trauma or suffering from PTSD. I work essentially with the organization Baigani, which is a woman organization. I'm invited. It's like the Presbyterian woman. Go with my wife, and sometimes, you can talk if you want. So I'm very privileged there. And Miriam College, which is a Catholic institution, women's college, where they do a lot of workshop for church workers and social workers around helping families victim of EGKs. And so that's what I do essentially in the Philippines. I provide workshop and tools to those workers. So let's go back a little bit on the human trafficking, choose your own adventure. So let's imagine. You're a mother of two. You're living with your parents in a small village with no employment. What can you do to make ends meet? A, stay home. Go back to school, maybe learn English better, maybe get a new skill, maybe learn a new job. Your parents might take care of your kids while you're at school, but you're getting new skills. Life's going to get better. You can move to the big city. You can decide to go to that gigantic city. You don't know anybody. You don't have much skills, but you might get lucky. Maybe you're going to find employment. You're going to have to let your kids at home because until you get a situation, it's very hard to feed children while you're looking for a job. Or you can go overseas. It happens that one of your family members knows someone in another country that needs a maid. Low qualification, but good salary. And they're going to provide you with a plane ticket, luggage, clothes. You're going to even get a gift, pasalubong, as we say in Filipino, for the family that's going to receive you. You just have to open the plane. And you'll be able to make enough money to send back to your kids. So what are you going to choose? Stay home? Move to the big city? How many of you, by the way, moved to the big city? I know that's very common here. You moved to the big city, Detroit. Or going overseas. What's up, honey? Where you want to go?
Korea.
Yeah, we're going to go to Korea soon, honey. Don't worry. Go overseas. That's a good deal. So you get in the plane, and when you arrive to the other country, you get arrested, and you end up in the death row. And you don't know why. Your name is Mary Jane Veloso, and you've been victim of human trafficking.
Mary Jane Veloso is the very first overseas Filipino worker that Juan and I learned about even before we knew there was such a thing as a overseas Filipino worker and an OFW acronym. When we interviewed for this position in Louisville, Kentucky, just weeks before, Mary Jane was freed from death row temporarily after 3 years. But she has actually been in prison for 8 years. 8 years. Now, I know you want to read the prayer, but just bear with me for a moment. Mary Jane turned 33 years old this January. She has not seen her 2 sons for a good part of their lives. And Mary Jane, well, she's languishing in prison in Indonesia. The trial for her job recruiters is still happening in the Philippines. This trial for 3 years has included character witnesses that will testify to her job recruiters, and it includes family members of Mary Jane Veloso. Mary Jane Veloso's testimony has yet to be included in this trial. True, how does that happen when she's all the way in Indonesia and the trial is happening in the Philippines? It can happen. It can happen. But for the time being, her testimony is still not yet to be included in the trial. Now, do all overseas Filipino workers become human trafficking victims? No. No. Migration and this movement makes one vulnerable. But for Mary Jane, it wasn't because of the drugs that were placed in her bag. She really thought she was on her way to a job. Indonesia was a transfer point. She was eventually going to Malaysia. But when the Indonesian authorities searched her bag and found the heroin in her bag, do you know what the job was? The job was not the job in Malaysia. The job was to serve as a drug mule. So that makes her a human trafficking victim. 8 years later, yes, it's been a long time, but the advocacy for her continues. When you hear about these situations, not only about Mary Jane, but the fact that Mary Jane is a metaphor, her name is a household name enough among the Filipino people that we say and we watch carefully to see what will happen in her situation. But did you know that even in a past experience, Mary Jane is not the first? On the far left, your left here, is a picture of a young woman named Flor Contemplacion. Flor Contemplacion was executed in Singapore 23 years ago. She is the first overseas Filipino worker that we know who was executed while working overseas. Why? Because she allegedly killed the son of another family entrusted to another overseas Filipino worker. While undergoing the trial, Flor did not receive much support from the Philippine government, and the Singaporean government also lacked in their legal provision for her. As a result of her death, many churches, many organizations were formed and galvanized into action. March 17th marks the day of her execution, but March 17th also marks the day when Filipinos will still remember in the form of a demonstration. Now, I'm not that old, but I can also say that it took me to the Philippines to march in my very first protest. This is my very first protest march. And under the hot sun, I could tell you that I learned my very first rallying cry. Trabajo sa Pinas, hindi sa labas. Pastor John, do you have a sense of what that means?
Work and Hindi is no. It's been a while.
Okay, so work in the Philippines, not overseas, not outside. Okay, but this is more than just a poetic cry. This is a real rallying cry for the government to do better by its countrymen, to provide the social conditions so that people will not have to even consider overseas employment. I mentioned that many churches, organizations were formed after, especially in light of the outrage around Flor Contemplacion's execution in Singapore. Migrante International was formed and now stands as the largest overseas Filipino worker organization spread out over 20 countries where many of the overseas Filipino workers are organizing. The United Church of Christ in the Philippines is our main partner in the Philippines. The denomination itself actually consists of 5 denominations, including the Presbyterian Church, and they created their own migrant ministry over 23 years ago. One of the newer partners that we work with is called the Churches Witnessing with Migrants. And while this name may imply that only churches are involved, let me first explain to you that when I say churches, I should also mean faith communities. Yes, the Philippines is a Christian country, but the Philippines also includes Muslims. And when we consider the countries of Southeast Asia as a whole, Christianity is but a small minority. What are the other religions that are represented? Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So this is a more inclusive, maybe not in name, but definitely in scope, ministry. The Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants is housed in Hong Kong, and it's one of the other partners with whom we work. How are some of the ways that we are responding? You know some of the organizations. What is the kind of work that we are about? This picture was taken, again, in another first of mine, a press conference. I've never had a press conference before, but it certainly is not the first of many press conferences for many of these faith leaders. Jennifer Dalquez and her campaign to overturn her sentence of death penalty is what we are featuring here. Jennifer Dalquez was a domestic helper in the United Arab Emirates who was fending for her life when her employer attempted to sexually assault her. She killed him instantly when she took the same knife that was being wielded against her to kill her employer. That murder constituted the death penalty for her. This campaign was the beginning of a several months long process to appeal to the United Arab Emirates judicial system as well as the Philippine government to do more not only for Jennifer Dalquez but for other overseas Filipino workers who find themselves in this very precarious situation. I'm happy to report that Jennifer Dalquez is no longer on death row. However, she's still in prison. There is a charge of theft that she must finish out, and we're hoping that in the next year or so that she will be home. But I think what we're hoping more for is that she won't have to go back overseas again. How else are we responding? This is the beginning of ways that we can know that parents themselves have become the advocates for their sons and daughters. This is a remembrance of other overseas Filipino workers. This is a small demonstration to remember the date when Mary Jane Veloso was first granted a reprieve from her execution in Indonesia. But more telling than this, and you could not tell possibly just by this picture was taken just a few steps away from the entrance to the presidential palace of Malacanang, the White House essentially. Here we are calling the government to step it up and actually advocate for clemency for those overseas Filipino workers who are on death row. How else are we responding? More than the churches, more than the organization, we individually, as countries, can do much more when we are together in solidarity. Last October, I had the chance to travel to Myanmar, and there I met and I learned about other countries and their efforts to combat human trafficking. May I introduce you to some of my new friends from Bangladesh, from South Korea, from Vietnam, Hong Kong, from Australia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka. And can I introduce you to Nanay Veloso? You have seen her in other pictures, but do you see in the front row the woman in the turquoise t-shirt? This is Mary Jane Veloso's mother, who continues to advocate for her daughter in different forums, including this one. This is how we can respond when we gather, not only to learn, but also in our statements. We produced this communique after our consultation. We began like this. We, the participants of the Asia Consultation on Human Trafficking and Forced Migration, are representatives of churches, church councils, economic bodies, mission partners, grassroots migrant organizations, and migrant-serving institutions in Asia. Migrants are people. They are not documents or the financial contributions that they make. As one migrant said, "Do not talk about us without us. We have answers and we have been voicing them. Listen and talk with us about migration, development, and human rights. All over the world, all migrants are collectively struggling and organizing to make our dreams come true." The work that we do as churches and migrant organizations is not complete without the testimonies of our victims and survivors. So to have Nanay Celia Veloso in our midst to be an advocate, to remind us that this is real and this is not just theoretical, is a reminder that we can go together in solidarity. How else are we responding to the situation of forced migration and human trafficking? While this might look like a group of young people that seem pretty happy, let me introduce to you them this way. These are young people who have now been working in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. Some have arrived just 2 weeks before this picture. Others have been working here for 15 years. These young people, they grew up in the youth group. They grew up as young adults in the churches of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. But the work is just not enough for their qualifications. Even for what they have studied in the Philippines has not provided them the adequate employment. Some are working in retail positions. Others are working in home health care. Others are working as IT professionals and human resource directors. This is not a church by some measures, but this is a gathering of serious Christians that take their faith seriously, that when they are working overseas, they don't want to be just overseas Filipino workers. They want to be faithful, and they want to take their faith into action. And so to visit them in the Middle East, to know that they are still part of the church that nurtured them, this is why we visited back in February, to say, you may be far from us, but near in spirit. And to offer a pastoral visit. This is not about going to Beaumont. This is not about going to the local hospital. This is a little bit longer distance, but it's pastoral care nonetheless. What are other ways that we are responding? This is a group of church leaders from various church denominations, Protestant mostly, and these are also migrant worker organizations represented. right before Easter this year, in late March, we gathered to learn about the ways that we can organize and collectively do our work better. Because there is no one-size-fits-all methodology about doing this work in the Philippines. Although we are united in identity, we still must understand that human trafficking looks a little different in each part of our own communities. But when we gathered, we also gathered with one very common purpose. In December of this year, the United Nations will most likely adopt what is called a global compact, a non-binding agreement in which member states will agree on some very general provisions around refugees and migrants. We gathered to understand how we might best lobby the Philippine government and lobby the United Nations that we might collectively share our opinions and move migrant rights forward in these kind of government and international agreements. How can you respond? You are responding, actually, and you've already been so gracious to us to welcome us and to share a little bit of what God is doing through this work in the world. So we ask you and implore you to continue to pray for us, for our partners, your letters, your care packages, even for our daughter. These are all ways that buoy our spirit and keep us going. Your financial gifts for our family enable us to work alongside of our partners. But you also now have an opportunity to be more intentional with your giving. We have a new ECO account which allows you to give specifically towards funds that will only go towards the different organizations, the different churches with whom we work. I will have principal oversight over this fund, but just like the countries that you saw represented, the new friends that I introduced you to, they're more than new friends. These are new colleagues. They're introducing me to their work, and they are in need of funding as well. To give you an idea of some of the funds that might be used and have been used in the past, we are hoping, for example, you heard about Mary Jane Veloso's trial and the trial of her recruiters. Some of the funds to support the pro bono lawyers for Mary Jane, they need transportation funds to move from Manila to the North Luzon, the region where the trial is happening. Without the presence of these lawyers, the trial will not continue. So to be able to provide the funding and the transportation, that is one. That is transportation within the Philippines. But imagine, churches, migrant-serving organizations do not have the travel expenses associated with taking and bringing together people in Myanmar. So this is another way of thinking about funds that are available. Would you like to come to the Philippines? Would you like to come back to the Philippines? For some of you, in May 2020, we're in the process of now moving towards creating a travel studies seminar that will introduce you not only to people, places in the Philippines, but our goal is this: not only to introduce you to the Philippines, but at least to go to Hong Kong or somewhere else where you can actually speak with migrant workers and to learn about the different organizations that support them when they are working overseas. Many of you already receive our updates, but if you would like to continue to do so, you can sign up. I think I had a sign-up sheet somewhere. I think I'll put that out. But you can sign up to receive our official quarterly newsletters. You can find me on Facebook. You can also sign up for semi-monthly email updates from our family. You can also follow our blog. Yeah, we'll pass the sign-up sheet, or you can come back up around. You have heard a lot. You've probably still trying to process a lot of what we have shared. So at this time, we'd invite any comments, questions that you might have.
one. I'm going to grab the other one up here so everyone can hear your questions as you ask them. You have them.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
Referring back to the slide that you had on the various occupations that these people are trained in, I'm curious as to
Go ahead, they'll get there.
yeah, right in there. There was a lot of occupations that would require some skills. How are they trained so that they can go out of the country and make money doing the skills that they show here?
They train here in the U.S. or trained by Americans. So there's a lot of Filipinos that have family here, and there's a lot of American living in the Philippines. So they all U.S. trained. To give you an example, in the Philippines, it's a Spanish tradition country, Catholic. The engineer is going to talk to you in gallon. The local people will talk to you in liters. Why? Because they train in the U.S. It's the same for most of all those jobs, especially in medical. They all train here. So it's very common to meet a professional who tells you, oh, I went to Chicago, or I went to San Francisco, and so on and so on. So they mostly train American style by American or here in the U.S.
So they're not really trained in the Philippines.
Because the Filipino system is based on the American system, yes, they train American. It's when you go to the Philippines and you work with Filipinos, it's very much like here, in their training, in their the way they do things in engineering and medical studies, and even in psychology. I was trained in France with a different set of mind than the Anglo-Saxon. So when I'm in the Philippines, I teach things that they're not used to here because they train American style, Anglo-Saxon style. So there is that big training there, which can be an issue in social work because the Filipino family system is completely different than the American family system. They don't work the same way than American family works. They're more Latino style family. So the set of mind of psychology as it was developed in Anglo-Saxon countries is different. So it doesn't work all the time the right way. But yeah, they're mostly American trained.
Then a follow-up.
Just saying, let's see if someone else has something first. Does anyone else before the...
And I've been to several lectures where there is a heightening awareness, shall we say, in Oakland County in southeast Michigan, because there's a lot of trafficking in this area. And part of it is, part of it's the sexual side, but they said there are a lot more people involved in the work side, and and that's a harder problem trying to get at because, but that's just kind of a comment that about our area around us. But what are the Catholics very much involved in this or not? Because you didn't mention anything about the Catholics.
Well, you start, I continue.
Well, Juan and I could probably have two different responses. And first of all, I'll share with you that some of the most progressive church folk that I have met in the Philippines are Catholic. Some of the most outspoken critics against the Filipino government are Catholic. And so, and all the ministry that we do, it is entirely ecumenical. It is not about one denomination trying to up the other, or there's a real ecumenical spirit. And so if I've somehow led you to believe that the Catholics are not part of this, no, they are very much leading the way.
There's a Catholic church in every neighborhood. It's the center of the life of every neighborhood. And every single Catholic church will have on the front of the church, in big letters, big sign, "You shall not kill." It's that simple. And for a lot of Filipino, that's the moral heart of their belief in the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic have been extremely vocal against the presidency and the president has been extremely vocal against them. So there's been a social war between the president and the Catholic Church on the moral ground, and the president has been very, very direct with them. He used very strong words against God and against religion in general.
While I bring this over, was there a nun who you all had worked with who has been expelled?
So yes. Well, Sister Pat has been working in the Philippines for 27 years, fighting for human rights and helping the needy. And a few months ago, the government decided to not renew her visa and to deport her. That process was fought against and it was stopped, but it has been brought back a week ago. So as I told you before when I was doing the presentation, there was the State of the Union of the Philippine government a few days ago. So there's a lot of political stances I've been taking around this time. And I think Sister Pat is one of the big ones for us. But other things happen.
So Sister Pat is Australian, but she could probably speak, as I've heard from other Filipinos, she speaks better Filipino than the typical Filipino. Yeah, but I did see something come through my Facebook newsfeed, and I'm sorry I can't substantiate fully, but she's Australian, but there are now human rights groups that are saying she should be granted Filipino citizenship. This is the only way that could make her immune from deportation. So I'm not sure where things stand now.
Okay, Mary Ann. No, just a second, Brian. Mary Ann.
Mary Ann, you go first.
You have to hold the mic right up to you.
I'm still phrasing my question, actually. It's, is like the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, do you see them as a helpful advocate, or are they a part of the problem?
In some ways, they are trying to provide as much oversight to legitimate and clean up what is business as usual. Okay, so I say yes, they are trying to do their job and cleaning up and saying who are the legitimate job recruiters that you could work with, and here are the fees that are legitimate, and just assisting workers who are maybe coming back or who are ready to go overseas to help them with those transitions. But I'm going to add an edge there to say that they're also making money, and the fees that they impose, and if you were to see, I don't have charts on this, but if you were to see how much money is being gathered because of the fees and the other, it still looks like a money-making scheme to me. Yeah.
Brian.
Yeah, mine's a kind of long.
The big issue also, just to add to that, is if working outside of the Philippines was beneficial or was positive for the country, if hardworking Filipinos will bring enough money to the country to make it better, the Philippines will be a rich country by today. But because the system has been going for so long, we know that the economy is abusing and using that system to have those low-paid workers, qualified low-paid workers, to come to the country to work. And so there's very little benefit for the country itself. And so all the people in between, they make money, but not the country. And so it's not very benefiting the Philippines itself.
In concert with the questionnaire, I was thinking, you said 10% of the population goes overseas to work, and many of them do send money back to the Philippines for their families, which adds to the GDP of the Philippines, I would assume. And your answer kind of stunned me. You would think the government and even the Catholic Church would then try to educate.
Brian, can you hold it right up? There you go.
Try
Thank
to
you.
educate these people more. But you said they were somewhat to the pitfalls of going overseas and providing any kind of assistance they could to them, but it doesn't seem like the government recognizes the benefit of these people going overseas and sending money back. Is that, am I misstating that, or?
So, without going into great detail, but I think, yes, it does benefit families in the short term. But I don't know if those short-term benefits are enough to constitute enough of a true improved status for the country as a whole. So we can look at micro and kind of just really family to family, just benefits that, kids can stay in school, for instance. Tuition fees are being covered because of a mom sending money back. But here's the thing. This is where I can kind of illustrate. Does that money change the ability for the government to change the education system, which is already lacking? No. I think the government, if I can say this, to be so bold to say this, the government has an incentive to keep conditions the way they are so they can continue to benefit from the labor export.
Yeah, here, let me, Cindy, you got it.
I got it. My legs aren't as long as yours, darling.
I had a question. Are a lot of these people?
Yeah, right up.
Is this working? Okay, thank you. A lot of these people that are
Right up, sorry, just right there.
okay, right. A lot of people that are coming over here, are they getting fairly decent wages, and are a lot of them overworked? Are they working long hours?
Well, if you ask a Frenchman, yes, they're overworked. But that's sadly my point of view. No, I think a lot of the Filipinos, qualified workers here in the Philippines, are making a very good living. We know of stories, and we know of Filipinos that actually make good money and send money back home, and they're very happy. And the numbers of hours, and that's one of the big issues. The numbers of work hours is not a problem for them. They're very resilient and they're hard workers. In some situation, when we reach situation of abuse, it's when they don't know their rights. And when having a day off in the week, it's hard or it's difficult to have. That's when we reach a situation like that. Or working 12 hours a day, it's a common thing. That's where we reach, because some of the workers will end up in a situation where they don't know their rights very well. And part of the education and advocacy is also to bring that knowledge to the workers, say, hey, you know what, you're in the US, you have some rights as a worker here. So, but no, a lot of the Filipinos, migrants, they stay here for a good reason. They have a job and they have a good situation.
Let me just briefly share with you a situation that I'm aware of in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong at the moment does not have any anti-human trafficking laws. But what they do have for laws for their foreign domestic workers are that if you are going to be serving a household, you are by law required to live with that family. There's a mandatory live-in arrangement. And yes, there are some provisions around housing. There are some general laws that kind of sound like they would protect the migrant worker, the domestic helper that's working inside a home. And while there is some general monitoring of these conditions, you might be surprised to know that there's a lot of interpretation of what is adequate housing, what privacy looks like, if any. And in the mandatory live-in arrangement, we don't know if it's just a condition of overwork or if overwork has spilled over then into abuse and exploitation.
Here you go.
I guess what would really throw some light on the value of a person working overseas as opposed to working at home or whatever. What is the rate of exchange in the Philippines as opposed to whatever country they're working in?
I can't go into that level of detail. I wish I could share with you, but maybe Juan could share a little bit more about just in terms of exchange rates and foreign exchange. Can you share?
I think right now it's 0.53 for a dollar. So you can, for 53 pesos, you get $1. 53 pesos, it's a meal. It's a good meal, actually, in the Philippines. The Filipino peso is very low in general. So wherever country you're going to go work, when you send money back home, you send good money home.
So it's very valuable for them.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, it is for the family in the Philippines. But the situation we end up sometimes is that some Filipino workers, they live very poorly in the country where they work, and their family at home live well. So that's also another part of the sacrifice they make sometimes. Because $500 can be a lot of money for someone making 1,000 here. In the Philippines, it's a lot of money. So there's also that kind of different world where they're living. A lot of Filipinos, families at home, live in a different world than the workers outside of the country.
Okay, we're going to take Forrest, and then I'm going to ask one, and then we'll close at 8 o'clock because we promised to have folks out at 8.
I'm not sure how to word this question, but it seems your work seems to be focused on advocacy for human rights for those that are being involved, are getting caught up in the system. Are you doing any work? To me, one of the I grew up in a different era, and I just talk to my kids about, are you familiar with ZPG? Yeah, the older generation is. And to me, one of the fundamental problems that the Philippines, as well as Malaysia, and the world for that matter, is population. And what you're telling me is that the resources within the Philippines aren't sufficient to support the population. So are you involved in any work to try to deal with the root of what I consider one of the roots of the problem versus the after effect of the problem?
It's going to be two different answers. When foreign companies come to buy a piece of land to feed someone else in another part of the world, it's not a population problem. It's a company coming to your land, taking your goods and selling them somewhere else, when those goods could be profit the people in this land. So that's different. Then it's a strong Catholic country. We says Catholics say
No birth
reproduction
control.
right. You have no choice. There's no abortion rights. There's no. I mean, there's a lot of organization fighting to be able to bring preservatives. I mean, how do you say in English? Condoms. Condoms. Sorry, in French it's preservative, of course. Here we use them a lot in the food, but yeah. It's very hard in a Catholic country, in a Christian country, to bring the idea of population regulation when the population regulation is based essentially on abstinence. And that's a very hard concept to deal with Christianity usually in most of the places. Because, well, yes, there's overpopulation. Yes, the populations keep on growing. But it keep on growing essentially because there's no options other when you get together than to have babies. And it's also a way of survival. In a lot of those countries, a way of survival. Because if you have children, then you have you expanding the chances to have someone working or more people working in the family.
This idea of the root causes, whether it's related to population or other, I think this is the harder work of addressing these issues. For example, the issue of zero population growth and why workers might need to be brought in to offset the lack of workers. This zero population growth also plays out in that way. So in some Asian countries, like Thailand or even other East Asian countries, this is why workers are brought in. But I haven't been able to fully explore zero population growth maybe as directly, but one thing that we are trying to do, at least in the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, is to begin to even have the conversation around sex and sexuality. Because, for instance, in some of our Catholic circles, the mere fact that we would even be talking about sex among our youth seems like it would be permission to be promiscuous, permission to explore. And there's a lot of fear in general in that among. So, for example, the idea of, will condoms make it more acceptable for unwanted pregnancy? I don't think so. But I think there's still a sense that, but this can also be one of the ways that we can explore how to be more intentional about addressing these issues too.
So before I make my comment and last question, on your table in the little buckets are envelopes. If any of you would like to take one with you, make a contribution tonight, make one, bring it back to the church, we will make sure that Cathy and Juan get it. Just real quickly about when I worked in the Philippines in the late 70s, there was a program called Masagana 99, and it was to make the nation self-sufficient in terms of rice production. And they actually did it. But part of what happened is what they were talking about is these large international firms like Dole, Del Monte, they came in and began buying up massive amounts of land, and all that land went out of rice production and went into production of things that ultimately make your ketchup, your crushed pineapple, so many of the things that we buy in the stores, and so it has really damaged the Philippines. So the last question that I want to ask, which was one of the significant issues when I lived there, was prostitution and trafficking in terms of prostitution. Is that something that you all work with or are part of groups that work with that, internal?
Prostitution is still at the heart of the ways that many women will make ends meet. What's become more of the awareness, especially in the Philippines, is that prostitution has now morphed because of the technology that enables sex and sex acts to be sold online. So this idea of cyber sex tourism, the cyber sex trafficking, that is how many Filipino families are also making ends meet. Parents will sell their children online, and foreign buyers will be able to do this pretty readily because of how easy it is to get onto the internet, not only with a regular computer screen, but now even more so with a smartphone. So prostitution, yes, still is a big, but even more the commercial sexual exploitation. That's another big component. We'd like to conclude our time understanding that the work that we do is not just about human rights, about pastoral care, but it's really rooted in the one who began this prophetic ministry and continues to give us reason, motivation, and energy even when we are not there. And it's a way of affirming together what unites us. So together, if you're able to, with your voice, through your own spirit, let us recite Luke 4:18 and 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the ears go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.